Hi, I hope you had a great break once again. Today we're going to look at the ballad form in poetry. So you will review this slideshow. We're going to go over what the ballad is, why it's important, and then you'll be answering some questions later about this ballad and another ballad. So we're going to look at the Ballad of Richard Cory by Edwin Arlington Robinson. That is a picture of him on the right-hand side. The ballad Richard Cory is a short dramatic poem with a dramatic ending. It's about a man who seems to have everything on the outside, but is really sad on the inside. This really goes along with Edward Arlington Robinson's life. In real life, he had brothers that died very young. His family suffers a lot of financial failures as he's trying to write and gain fame, and he has a lot of trouble gaining fame. But in 1897, he writes a poetry collection called Children of the Night, and the whole poetry collection is about the hardships of man and the hardships of living as a person in his time period. This poem in particular becomes a favorite to many teachers because of the main character and the ending of the poem. So let's take a look at this. First, we need to know the definition of a ballad. So a ballad is a short narrative poem, which means it tells a story. Original ballads were very old and they were recited or handed down orally from person to person, and they changed over time. A literary ballad, like the one we're going to look at today, has a single author. So one person who has written down the story and in a way that it sounds like a song. It usually rhymes and is easy to remember. So we're going to take a look at this poem and then discuss why it is a ballad along with why it is important. So here's the poem, Richard Cory by Edwin Arlington Robinson. I'm going to read the poem for you first, and then we'll go back and take a look at it. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from soul to crown, clean favored and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pauses when he said, "Good morning," and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything, to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer's night, went and put a bullet through his head. So that's it. That was the poem. Were you surprised by the ending? You probably should have been. But it is clearly a story about a man who's unhappy and very sad. So how do we know it's a ballad? How do we know it's a story? Let's take a look at that. We need to look at the poem's structure, how the poem is put together, and there's two really important things in the structure that we're going to look at today. First is the rhythm. So this poem has rhythm. It rhymes and it follows a certain pattern. In this poem, we follow an iambic pentameter pattern. And what that really means is the poem is broken down into syllables. When you were little, you probably learned how to count out syllables by clapping. So whenever is 3 syllables. Richard is 2 syllables. Well, each line in this poem has 10 syllables. The line or the words that are in red are the words that seem to be stressed. And the word or the syllables in black are unstressed, which means we say them just a little bit softer. So if we were counting out our iambic pentameter, we would do the same thing, clapping and counting. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown. If we did that for an entire line, it sounds kind of silly, but it would actually have 10 syllables of unstressed followed by stress, which means iambic pentameter or rhythm. So while you're reading the poem, there is a certain rhythm or a certain flow to it. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, and you can kind of hear that, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from soul to crown. We don't always read or talk that way, but the iambic pentameter is kind of there, and our ears will hear that iambic pentameter. Rhythm and iambic pentameter actually will help us remember the poem. It's very much like when you look at or hear a song, you remember it because of the rhythm. We also need to look at the end rhyme, because the end rhyme also helps us remember a poem or remember a song. And poetry and singing are very similar. So when we look at the end rhyme, it's there. It's going to help us remember that and create a feeling. So town, hymn, crown, slim. If you see, town and crown rhyme, and hymn and slim rhyme. It's at the end of the line, so it's called an end rhyme. If it were in the middle, okay, then it would be a middle rhyme. But in this case, it's the end rhyme. And if you remember back to your lesson yesterday, when you're looking at end rhymes, you can come up with the rhyme scheme. So if we have town and crown that rhyme, we would give both of those an A, and hymn and slim, we would give both of those a B. So we can look at the rhyme scheme in this poem, and a ballad needs to have rhythm and rhyme. So the rhyme scheme in Richard Cory is the A, B. As we said, we would give 2 A's and 2 B's. If we look at the second stanza here, and he was rich, yes, richer than a king. Well, king doesn't rhyme with grace, but it rhymes with everything. So it doesn't rhyme with the first stanza. So now we would give king and everything a C, and grace and place a D. After that, our rhyme scheme should be pretty easy to figure out. So we have an A, B, C, D rhyme scheme. That's our first clue that we have a ballad. We have rhythm through our iambic pentameter. We have rhyme with our rhyme scheme. And why that's important in many forms of poetry, it has to exist in a ballad. So now we just have to be able to see, in order to be a ballad, not only does it have to have these elements, but does it have to tell a story? So let's take a look. Well, first of all, we have a speaker in the poem. Remember, every poem has a speaker. It's the voice of the poem. Sometimes it's the poet, sometimes it's not. Let's take a look at this poem. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. Well, the we becomes really important. Who's the speaker of this poem? Remember that in this instant with the we, the speaker becomes important because he's part of the story. That's another clue. If the speaker is part of the story, it might actually tell a complete story, and then it would. So, word choice really here reveals the speaker. We, people on the pavement. He says that we are the people on the sidewalk looking, on the outside, looking in at Richard Cory, our main character. So we have a main character, and we have a speaker or a narrator that is watching the main character. We looked at him. So we have 2 clues that this may be a ballad. We have rhythm and form, and we have a narrator and a main character. So we should look. Is there a setting? Now, all poetry pretty much has a setting, but is it a setting that would lead to a story with our main character? And in this poem, we do have a setting. Take a look at that. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, there's our first clue. It is a town. So we're looking at a town. He didn't say a big city. He didn't say a country or farmland. It's a town, and there we have our clue. The other words also let us know what kind of town it is. Is it a big town or small town? And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace, to make us wish that we were in his place. We know everything, or the townspeople know everything about Richard Cory, or at least they think he does, as far as basically walking in town, and they're kind of talking about him. They all wish, the narrator knows, they wish they were in his place. So they're sitting there somewhere in a building talking about Richard Cory. And then the last part of the poem, and Richard Cory one calm summer night went and put a bullet through his head. Once again, they know what happened to Richard. The townspeople know. So it's not a big town. It's a town where everybody knows about the main character. So we call that a small town setting. So now we have our form, we have our main character, we have our narrator who's part of the story, and we have our setting. A little more clear. As we start to put all this together, we're seeing the elements of a story. So right here, it gives us the clue, or the first clues, that this is a story. Every story needs an ending, and it should have a message. So we're going to take a look at that now. Does this poem have an ending and a message? And by the way, it has a mood. If you look at this in the beginning, the mood, Richard Cory is wonderful, and we want to be him. It's kind of a nice mood, and then bam, the mood changes when he's shot in the head. So that also helps add to the idea that this is a ballad. It's going to tell us. So the theme that goes along with that mood is, what does the author want you to learn? What ideas about life does the author want you to look at? So we need to look at Richard Cory and the other characters in order to see at least two of the themes that I'm talking about today. The first is wealth and happiness. Okay, Richard Cory is really contrasted with the poor people. He's very rich, they're very poor, and we see that as the story progresses. The narrator is part of the community. He says, we people on the pavement, but that's really important. We people on the pavement, on the streets. We're in the downtown streets, and Richard Cory comes in. He walks the streets, but he doesn't live there. So we see him when he comes in, he walks the streets, he has a lot of money. We're downtown folk. We're kind of poor. And then he talks about that poorness more as the story goes on. So they're different, they're separated. In the final stanza, he makes it even clearer that Cory is rich and the community is not. He says the community must give up all their luxuries. We went without the meat. We had no meat to eat and cursed the bread. We were so poor that we only had bread to eat. He doesn't say Cory didn't have bread to eat. He says we did. So we wanted to be Cory, Richard Cory. We wanted to have the things that he had, and we were too poor to have it. It's like a jealousy. They envy him in this. So we have that contrast of wanting to be rich, and most of us can relate to that. Even if you live comfortably, there are people who have more, and you always want for more. So that's the first thing. Yet, at the end of this poem, we kind of wrap the second theme in with this idea of being rich and poor. Does that make you happy? Well, appearances can be deceiving. So Richard Cory is rich. He's richer than a king. He seems to be schooled. He seems to be happy. So happy that we wish we were in his place. The community who looks at him, okay, so we look at him from the streets, thinks that he has everything. They want to be him, not just his wealth, but they want his happiness because he looks very happy as he walks down the street with all this grace. But nowhere in the story do we get to see the real Richard Cory, what's happening when he goes home. So we don't get to see how unhappy he is. We don't get to see what leads to his suicide, just like the audience doesn't get to see, or the people in the story that the narrator talking about, the townspeople. They don't get to see why he put a bullet in his head. We never find that out. And it's really not important. The important thing is that sometimes people aren't as happy as they actually seem. And the fact that just because you're rich doesn't make you more happy than if you were poor. The townspeople aren't committing suicide. So let's take a look at this resolution and surprise ending that really talks about this. And Richard Cory one calm night went home and put a bullet through his head. So he's ultimately unhappy, and this is what is kept from us to the very end, and it's our big reveal. It's the resolution, the ending of the story, where we see, oh, here was the problem all along. This is a story about a man who was unhappy and killed himself. Because it has a beginning, a middle, and resolution, and all those other elements, it is a ballad, a dramatic story with a dramatic ending.